Hello, Jeremy, and welcome to the podcast. What do you think about the event so far?
Well, it just started, so not much.
Okay.
But the place is pretty nice.
Could you please talk about what you do, where you come from, where your passion for AI comes from?
Sure. So I'm an analyst at a company called SemiAnalysis, which is a boutique company doing research on semiconductors and AI. We operate a Substack with about 150,000 subscribers. You can check it out. Articles are accessible for free, and we wrote very in-depth articles, really trying to understand the products and the technology behind those products related to semiconductors and AI, right? And so my background, personally, I started as a buy-side analyst, working at a fund manager, evaluating investments into equities, right? I looked a lot into the semiconductor sector. In Europe, we have stocks such as ST Microelectronics, Infineon, Soitec. So I was a lot into that area. I'd say especially the more industrial part of semiconductors. And that's how I got to know SemiAnalysis, and I joined the company. And since joining, I've been focusing a lot of my time around data centers, which obviously today in the AI world is one of the most crucial aspects.
Yeah. Let's talk about data centers, because I think it's a word that is thrown around a lot lately, especially with the rise of AI. Could you just give a brief introduction to data centers? Like, what are their key characteristics? What are the differences between various data centers? What it actually is, what it looks like? Just give basically a brief overview of what it is.
Sure. So, at the high level, a data center is simply a facility where you place IT equipment, such as servers, which are basically your computers, storage to store data, and networking, right? So there are like many shapes and sizes of data centers. It can range from a small room within an office building to a huge campus with multiple very large buildings, typically operated by hyperscalers such as Google, Microsoft, and so on and so forth. I'd say if you want to categorize data centers, the right way to look at it is what is the power capacity of a building, meaning how much power can you put into this facility, because how much power you can put into a building dictates how many pieces of equipment, how many servers you can put in that facility, right? So we typically use watts or kilowatts or megawatts as the unit, and those small rooms within office buildings would typically be rated in a few kilowatts, whereas the large hyperscale campuses are typically in the hundreds of megawatts, right? And as a rule of thumb, 1 megawatt roughly is the amount of electricity needed to power about 1,000 households, right? So when we talk about multiple hundreds of megawatts, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of households, right? It's really huge amounts of electricity in a very dense location.
Yeah. And so data centers today are talked about the most because of AI. But we had a need for data centers before already. So do you have any idea when they started to appear, what they were used for, what was the most profitable maybe, or like whatever?
Sure. So the concept is as old as computers, right? Because it's simply the location where you place your computers, right? So you actually had data centers in the 50s, in the 60s. We talked about mainframes back then. The difference was that computers were so large that you needed a dedicated facility to put those computers. Of course, the power requirements were not the same because at that time we didn't have like such a progress on the electronics to handle such amounts of power, right? So basically, you had these huge computers in those big areas. And progressively what happened is with Moore's law and the shrinking of transistors, computers got smaller and smaller. And I'd say around the dot-com era, so late 90s, you started to see data centers resembling what we have today, meaning racks filled with servers, and so facilities with hundreds or thousands of servers resembling what we have today, right? And I'd say the more recent trend, which is about since the last 15 years, has been the rise of very, very large data centers, again rated in the tens or hundreds of megawatts, which are typically built by and operated by hyperscalers such as Google for their large recommendation models, for social media and so on and so forth, cloud computing.
Yeah. I think as we talk about the past, it's also interesting to see like the transition from one usage to another one of these data centers. As you said, it started in the 50s, right? So how has the usage of data centers evolved over the last years? Basically, computing, AI, anything like that.
Sure. I mean, computing has obviously been the main driver behind data centers, right? The need for more compute. Initially, it was mostly centered around the military use cases, right? And as we approached the dot-com era, computers started to become more mainstream, and companies had more and more data needs, especially as they wanted to be in the internet. And so they started to have that requirement to build their own facilities, what's called on-premise data centers, because it's a data center inside the premises of a company, right? But then what happened is progressively this became more and more expensive, more and more complicated to handle all that infrastructure. So this led to the creation of new models. One being the colocation business model, where it's actually a third-party developer that will own and operate a data center and have multiple tenants placing their own servers inside that facility, right? And the other one, which started about in 2005, 2006, is the cloud computing era, where companies, Amazon has been the pioneer in that regard, started to buy servers and offer those servers to external companies, but with servers all managed by Amazon, right? So that's kind of the latest use case. And then AI, I mean, obviously AI can mean many things. Initially, AI was more of a hyperscale sort of computing requirement, with companies like Meta and Google running those large recommendation models inside their own data centers. But today with Gen AI, this is sort of a new era. Obviously, we're still unveiling what's happening there.
One of the main things that are needed for data centers is the uptime. Basically, the ability to run 24/7. So how can data centers ensure their reliability and their uptime today? What are the main factors for that?
Sure. So one of the area very specific about data centers is that given that they require a lot of power in a dense location, you actually need a very specific electrical system. Think equipment like switchgear, transformers, UPS. I can explain in a bit in more detail, and also a specific cooling system, right? And so to ensure reliability, it really comes down to having a reliable electrical system and a reliable cooling system. So the first step, which are a bit obvious, is obviously to go buy equipment from reliable manufacturers. Also use solutions such as a UPS system for uninterruptible power supply, which is connected to a bank of batteries to ensure that power always flows. Then you can have also backup generators, although the environmental associations typically don't like them because generators can make a lot of noise and obviously can be very polluting because they run on diesel. But they are typically a necessity for data centers, as you want to have your IT equipment running all the time. IT equipment is typically mission critical for companies, so you can't afford to have a downtime or just a very tiny amount of downtime. So that's why you need those backup generators as well to provide power in case there is a failure with the local utility.
Yeah, exactly. Because one of the questions that I have is because right now we have, for example, a tornado near the US, right? And so, for example, in these cases, where the grid is off for most of the population around the place. So basically, there are the backup generators which ensure that the data center still stays up, right?
Yeah, exactly. And also before that, site selection is also an important factor. Companies will typically look for sites which are less subject to tornadoes or to seismic activity and all kind of natural disasters.
Yeah, and also maybe for example, to optimize for cooling, as you explained, it's one of the most important factors for data centers. So would the data centers go for colder places in the first place in order to not spend so much on cooling, or would they go anywhere basically?
So site selection for a data center is a complex topic. Generally, it comes down to a few critical factors. So typically, fiber availability is a critical one because generally you want to be connected to the internet, right? To have access to a wide network and also to be connected to maybe data centers at another area, which could be thousands of kilometers away, maybe in another continent. So to do that, you must ensure you have good fiber connectivity. Obviously, access to power is very important. And then the location for cooling is also important. So it's a trade-off between all of those locations, and like going to like the North Pole, could be attractive for cooling, but if you don't have access to fiber, then it doesn't work, right? So you have to balance all those trade-offs.
Yeah. And also, I think the thing with data centers, as you explained, we have the growing needs every year now, especially with the AI growth in the last years. So for this, you need space. On the one hand, on the other hand, we are trying to optimize for scalability, meaning we are making smaller and smaller computers with more and more power. So how has the industry adapted to the need of space and scalability over the last years?
So first of all, I'd say computers are now becoming bigger and bigger. As Jensen would say, we want to build bigger and bigger GPUs, and that's what he's doing, building bigger and bigger GPUs. But definitely the trend is with Gen AI, you have really an unprecedented acceleration in terms of power demand for data centers, right? People are buying a lot of chips from NVIDIA and other manufacturers, and this requires a lot of power, right? And so to get access to that power, basically what happens is the trade-offs I mentioned before are kind of sort of changed, right? If you talk about AI training activity, actually your connectivity needs are not as important. But what is more important is to have access to power, right? And to large amount of power. So site selection is now changing, and you see people building data centers in sort of non-traditional areas, right? Traditional being typically Northern Virginia, which is famous to be the data center alley because fiber connectivity is so good. But getting access to 500 megawatts, a gigawatt of power in Northern Virginia today is not possible. Or maybe it is, but by 2035, so it's way too late. So now people are building data centers in new locations, which are not traditional for a typical data center operator, but where they can get a lot of power fast, and they can build their own fiber network if needed, and it will be a much shorter time frame compared to what it would take to get power in locations like Northern Virginia.
Yeah. Okay. There is this famous quote of Anthropic CEO during an interview, he's basically like a doomer of AI while being the CEO of one of the biggest AI companies. So he said that in the future we will need three things. We will need one data center, we will need one nuclear plant in order to power the data center, and then we will need a bunker in case AI goes rogue and destroys everything. So, do you agree with this statement?
I think he meant that as a joke. I'm not sure he was 100% serious. Well, it's a vision of the future. I don't think it's accurate. Definitely, nuclear and data center make a good combination.
Yeah,
you're seeing an increasing amount of deals, such as, for example, the 3 Mile Island reactor in Pennsylvania that's being restarted, with Microsoft signing a large PPA for that.
Yeah, increasing like this trend.
So today, I'd say this is mostly I want to say marketing, right? Because there are no small modular reactors, SMRs, are not at scale today. Right, and so when we talk about SMRs powering data centers, we talk about SMRs maybe in 2030, something like that. And in the AI era today, people want power now. They want power as fast as possible.
Yeah.
They don't want power by 2030. So actually, despite all those deals, what's going to power AI in the next few years is not SMRs, it's not nuclear either, because nuclear takes a long time, even larger reactors. So it will be a combination, of the typical gas and renewables.
Yeah, the basic energy mix.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. I have a question for data centers. As we said, there are a lot of data centers around the world, and as you said, they have many use cases today. But we are seeing with Gen AI, especially, most of the data centers that existed in 10 years ago, they are not compatible with the type of requirements that AI has today, especially Gen AI. So do you think that most of the data centers will have to adapt to the growing needs of AI, or do you think they will just remain for other use cases for now?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So it depends. It depends on what kinds of workloads. But if you talk about like training or inference of the frontier models, you definitely need very vast amount of power, and also the key change is really density, right? Because when you talk about density, basically it means placing chips much closer to each other,
Yeah.
right? And so it's kind of a double impact. One is for AI, the chips are much more powerful than than traditional CPUs. So the way to look at it is called the TDP. It's kind of the power capacity of a chip, and H100 is 700 watts, for example, and this is gonna double or maybe triple in the next few years,
Yeah.
right? So a lot of power per chip, but then we also want them to be as close as possible. And the reason is because that can enable sort of new technologies, for example, new types of parallelisms for inference and for training, which can largely improve performance. But I'd say, so this is mostly applicable for, again, large models. Right, so for those data centers, definitely we will need to do new types of designs. So the first obvious answer is liquid cooling. Today, most data centers are cooled using air. Liquid is still a very immature technology, but it's really brought to the front line today by NVIDIA, pushing for the GP200 rack, which is a 120 kilowatt rack only available through liquid cooling. So that's one of the key changes, and most data centers cannot handle that kind of workloads,
Yeah.
right? However, if you talk about inferencing small models, for example, maybe you need just one server. You know, like one server of H100 is 10 kilowatts. So some legacy data centers actually can't handle that. But I'd say a good amount of modern data centers, most modern data centers, can handle that without any issue.
Yeah,
Right.
I think you touched a really good point. It's about liquid cooling, because I think we had a double transition. At first, liquid cooling was quite popular. Then it became not scalable enough, so we went for air cooling. And now the liquid cooling is back on the table. So do you think that in the future, most of the data centers will use liquid cooling rather than air?
Yeah. Again, it's really a transition driven by technology. By having those GPU close to each other, by increasing the density, basically you can largely improve the inference throughput and the training throughput as well, right? Using technologies such as NVLink, for example, which is a proprietary networking technology by NVIDIA, and to get such amounts of density, liquid cooling is a must-have. Right. So what we see is in the next 2 years, people will use sort of inefficient solutions such as liquid to air. It's simply because data centers cannot handle liquid cooling. So liquid to air is a sort of bridge solution where you can actually do liquid cooling, but you sort of have a liquid to air heat exchanger, which is much less efficient and takes much more space. So it's really not ideal. But I would expect that in the future, many data centers will transition towards liquid cooling, especially data centers which are performing workloads for inference workloads for like frontier models, or also for training of frontier models.
Yeah. So we talked a lot about data centers. Now let's focus on GPUs themselves. So we have seen their prices skyrocket over the last years. So if we talk about basic GPUs, the ones that you put in your computer, basically, you had the crypto boom in 2017, 2020, when people started mining crypto. Now it's AI. And so basically, AI companies have a huge need for GPUs today. And so what we see as a trend is the AI companies just raise money every time without being profitable, because the GPU costs are so high and they have so many needs for that they are ready to pay the price. And so basically, do you think in the coming years the access to GPUs will become easier in some way or more affordable in order not to spend so much money on GPUs themselves, but more on the development of the company itself?
So I'd say the cost of GPUs is likely going to rise further, But the more interesting trend is that each GPU will have its throughput capabilities expand dramatically, right? So for example, in 2025, the flagship platform of NVIDIA is called the GB200 NVL72. And on our estimates, for training, you have a 3 to 4x improvement compared to H100s. And for inference, it can go up to 10x improvement, right? So those new technologies, those new platforms brought by NVIDIA, despite having the price per GPU actually go up, the cost per flop, because what in the end, what you want as an AI company is either a flops to train your model or tokens per second when you do inference, right? And the cost per flops or the cost for token per second is going to go down very fast, right?
Okay.
And so despite the GPUs being more expensive, actually the tokens and the flops are going to become much cheaper.
Okay, so basically, the GPUs will still be quite costly, while the access for people to AI will become less expensive.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, got it. We talked. I think you mentioned NVIDIA like 10 times since the beginning of the of this podcast. So it's clear that NVIDIA today has basically a monopoly over GPUs in the world. Do you think it's something that is likely to stay this way, or do you think there are any contenders that could take a chunk of a pie from NVIDIA?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So obviously everybody's talking about NVIDIA today. In our view, so if you want to build a great AI chip, you basically need three key capabilities, right? One is hardware design. You want to build great hardware, obviously.
Yep.
Two is software. So NVIDIA has talked a lot about CUDA, for example, which is it's a software stack, right? And the third one, which is less discussed, is networking. Basically, GPU to GPU communications. The reason is because typically when you want to train or also inference a model, you can't do it on just one GPU or one chip. You need to have multiple GPUs talking to each other, right? Mm-hmm. And so having a great technology of GPU to GPU communication is also crucial. And the thing is, NVIDIA is actually the leader in all three categories, right?
Yeah.
There are other companies doing great job at designing hardware, such as AMD, for example, but they don't have the same software capabilities. And at SemiAnalysis, we know that pretty well because we actually test the GPUs ourselves. We have an AI engineer in our team who has been doing a lot of testing, both AMD and NVIDIA, and running AMD software is a little bit more challenging. To be clear, AMI 300X can have a good TCO, but it requires much more engineering resources to actually make it work as seamlessly as you do it with an H100. Right? Yeah. Basically that's the issue. Is NVIDIA is the best at all those three capabilities. Now it depends also on the types of workloads. So. Our view is that the majority of workloads will be done by very large models, right? Because they offer the best performance. For very large models, the GPU to GPU communication is crucial because you need to build very large supercomputers, with thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of GPUs, right? But then for smaller models, actually other solutions can actually enable better performance, right? So you see solutions such as Cerebras, such as Grok, who in our view are not competitive for large models, but may offer some degree of competitiveness for smaller models, right? So there's a market there. And then the last piece, which is like, it's not available for everyone, it's only for the hyperscalers. They are all working on their own internal chips, right?
Yep.
So there's a narrative out there that hyperscalers will displace NVIDIA by making their own chips. But what people, I think, misunderstand is that this is actually much harder than what most people think, and especially the cost side of it is very challenging. In the sense that hyperscalers, they typically have good hardware design capabilities. They also have the software, obviously, because it's vertically integrated, right? But the networking technology, they have to acquire that from a third party.
Okay.
So there are two main companies doing that. It's Broadcom and Marvell, right? And those companies know they are absolutely essential to hyperscalers,
Yep.
which means that they actually charge huge prices, right? And so the narrative that by designing your own chip, you can bypass the gross margin of NVIDIA, which is about 75%, which is obviously huge. This narrative is this narrative forgets that if you want to bypass NVIDIA, you'd have to pay the Broadcom tax or the Marvell tax, which may not be 75%, but more than 60%. So you do save some money, but you cannot you cannot bypass basically having to pay some partner.
Yeah, yeah, and so NVIDIA is still, even if it's a leader today, it's still associated with some risks, especially geopolitical risks because of Taiwan and China, the tension between the two countries. And so if this risk came to materialize, what would happen to the AI industry and like basically the GPU industry?
Okay, so if this risk, I mean, I assume you're talking about Taiwan invasion,
Yes,
right?
yeah.
So obviously, a lot of things would change. This would be more of a sort of war-style scenario, right?
Yeah.
So it would probably be up to the government to define what are the priorities, right? For example, if you think about U.S. demand, so first of all, we have some manufacturing capabilities in the U.S. There are some Intel fabs. There's a TSMC one under construction. And there are an increasing amount of projects being built in the U.S. Yeah. So there are domestic manufacturing capabilities, but they cannot and by no means address all of the demand from U.S. Design firms, right? So then it's a question of allocation. What do you want to produce, right? So yeah, it's an open question. Obviously, companies like Apple also have a huge demand for chips. You know, they have a huge business, so they also have a big say in that table. So it's an open question, but disruption would be huge for everyone.
Yeah,
it's a war scenario basically.
It's quite funny because you've talked about like Asia and the US. We have never talked about Europe. Do we have any initiatives about data centers or production or anything going on in Europe? Anything besides regulation?
Well, I mean, there are no leading edge manufacturing. Well, there's Ireland for Intel, but I'd say, yeah, definitely in the leading edge world. So leading edge means the best chips available out there. Europe is really not a player in that game.
Yeah.
It's all about Taiwan and the US. So yeah, basically on the semiconductor side, Europe is not there. Europe has some capabilities, but more in what we call lagging edge chips, which are typically for industrial purposes, automotive.
Yeah.
Europe has a very good actually positioning in the automotive market, for example, with the power semiconductors such as silicon carbide, microcontrollers, and so on and so forth. But for the AI leading edge chips, Europe is not positioned, right?
Yeah.
In terms of data centers, so I mean, there are pretty developed data center markets in Europe. Paris is a big one, for example. We talk about the FLAP-D markets. Paris, London, Dublin, Frankfurt, and so on and so forth, Amsterdam. And so Europe has data centers, definitely, and those markets are growing. But unfortunately, Europe has a lot of, one is power constraints. So in the US, we were talking about building gigawatt data centers. This is going to happen faster than most people think, by the way. Building gigawatt data centers, and in Europe, this is actually extremely challenging to do, and not on the same time frames, right? Yeah. So that's the first thing. And the second thing, in Europe, there's a strong not in my backyard, phenomenon, where sometimes companies actually get the permits, everything is ready for them to build a data center, and suddenly there's a sort of local community protest from people saying, I don't want a data center in my backyard. But it's understandable, right? Those are huge buildings. They can make a lot of noise. The difference is that Europe is much denser compared to the US, right? The US is a huge country. There are a lot of plots of land. So yeah, it's.
I mean, the US oil production, they actually install like empty buildings inside cities. Nobody knows what's going inside, but it's actually oil pumps which are going into the soil. So
exactly, it's just a different world. Right?
Just don't say it's a data center. Just say like it's like a factory or something. So how do you think the data centers and basically the whole industry will evolve in the coming years? What will be the major evolutions, major changes?
Yeah, so I'd say the key change that's going to happen over the next few years is really the change of scale, right? For example, looking at energy is an interesting way to look at it. For example, on our estimates, GPT-4 was trained on about 20,000 A100s, right? In terms of electricity, that's about 18 megawatts. 18 megawatts of power, 1 megawatt is about 1,000 homes, so 18 megawatts is not nothing. But on the data center scale, it's something that's pretty common, in hyperscale. Hyperscalers, they build 50 to 100 megawatt buildings, right? So we are shifting from this. So this is the models we currently use to something actually much bigger, right? So currently the next generation models are being trained right now. We're training them on about 100,000 H100s. So now we're talking about 120 to 130 megawatts, right? And then next generations are going to get built in campuses much, much larger, right? Yeah. And by 2026, you're going to start to see gigawatt data centers. Gigawatt data centers, it's basically the output of a nuclear reactor. Yeah. So that's huge increase in scale. Is really something that's going to change the models we interact with, because they're just going to have, whole different scale compared to what we use today. So I'd say it's very likely that the models we use right now compared to the models we use in 2 to 3 years are going to be very different.
Okay. And so we are seeing Google that might be entering the nuclear race as well with their small reactors, which only power data centers. Yeah. Do you think we will see more and more AI companies entering this race, going more, investing in power more in order to be able to power their data centers?
So yes, definitely. Power is a huge topic because, again, people are now have the ambition to build gigawatt data centers. There are many sites planned, and getting that amount of power is obviously non-trivial. So basically, you start to see companies partnering much more closely with utility providers, and that can mean contributing to build power plants, signing more PPAs, and all of that stuff to help to help improve the power generation infrastructure. I'd say a good example of that is again the 3 Mile Island PPA deal that Microsoft signed with Constellation, 850 megawatts. So they're gonna it's basically a virtual PPA to help restart a nuclear power plant. Right, and we'd expect that kind of deal to happen more frequently, indeed.
Okay, so we have seen the news that OpenAI might not be profitable for the next few years. So as you said, the GPUs will be more and more costly in the years to come. OpenAI will need more and more GPUs to operate and to innovate and to provide new solutions. So what is the solution for them to be profitable? Is it constantly raising funds at a bigger and bigger and bigger valuation? We have seen Elon Musk yesterday that might raise funds for XAI at a 40 billion valuation. So what are the solutions for the companies that operate in AI that need GPUs and that are not profitable today?
Raise a lot of money. Yeah, so that's probably the first step. We'd expect OpenAI to come up with another fundraising maybe sometime next year or in 2 years, who knows. We wouldn't be surprised if we start to see huge numbers, 10, 20, 30, maybe $50 billion capital raise, something like that, because, again, their investment needs are huge, right? Yes. So that's definitely one of the trends that we expect to keep seeing, more capital raise from OpenAI, XAI, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, what they're doing is also making all sorts of improvements to help make the inferencing aspect of models cheaper, right? GPT-4o was a good example, right, where through a few architectural improvements, they actually reduced the cost to inference, right? Yeah. The other aspect is also those companies are investing in building better products in the hope of obviously getting more and more users, right? Yeah. And today, ChatGPT is about 200 million users. What if it scales to 1 billion, 2 billion? Then even if the company is not profitable, when you have that many users, this is definitely worth something because everybody knows that eventually you're probably going to be able to monetize them, right? And so that will certainly be a factor that will help them keep raising money if needed and eventually be profitable, right? And enterprise is also obviously a very, very, very larger portion of that as well.
Yeah, but the other question that comes to mind when you hear this is basically why would investors put some money into that? So basically they expect a profit, right? But so, for example, for the future raises, the investors should stay still invested in the company, because if you're only raising to let your previous investors get out of the deal, it means that you're not actually raising for innovation. You're basically exiting the previous investors. And then on the other hand, the new companies that enter the race, as you said, they have like 1-2 billion users, whatever. Why would they invest in the company besides like influencing the AI and like the development of AI? So these are the two questions that I have. So basically, if you raise, doesn't it raise some concerns for the future as a private company? And on the other hand, the investors that are already in, what are they expecting from their investment?
I mean, it's capitalism, right? You expect to make some money, right? So basically, you invest because you believe in the company. It's capitalism, and so like.
Yeah, but on the other hand, if the company is not profitable.
Yeah, of course. So that's obviously a very European way of thinking, right? I want to see profits now. In the US, the less revenue you have, the easier to raise money.
Yeah.
It's kind of a running meme there, but like, yeah. So obviously, it's not profitable today. But if you think about it, OpenAI has a great shot at building the next hyperscale business, right?
Yeah.
Again, 200 million users. What if they scale that to 2 billion, 3 billion users? Then maybe eventually they could build a hyperscale business similar to what Meta built or what Google built, and look at their valuations, right? Those are companies worth $1 trillion, $2 trillion, right? So if you think about it, OpenAI has a shot at building the next hyperscale business, and a hyperscale business is valued in trillions, not in billions.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the bull case. Obviously, it may or may not happen, but it's definitely one of the scenarios on the table.
Do you think in the long term we'll have more institutional users for AI, like companies that integrate AI and that bring more profitability to these companies, or do you think it will be more retail focused?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think right now OpenAI is trying to do both. That's which obviously like both are great businesses, right? Like if you think about it, today you could argue Meta and Google are mostly consumer focused and they have $1 trillion businesses, and Microsoft on the other hand is more business focused and it has also a $1 trillion company, right? So both can do miracles. OpenAI right now is trying to do both. We'll see. I mean, who knows, right? But so far they seem to have a decent amount of success on both ends, right? So obviously that's also why people are okay pouring a lot of money into this company, because there are like two areas for which they could build a hyperscale $1 trillion business, basically.
Yeah. And so we're getting to the end of this interview. And so do you have anything to close this topic to say basically like this is your time, your free time here?
Well, I'd say don't be too skeptical. There is still a huge infrastructure investment going on. Again, given the change of scale, we should expect to see huge model improvement. We should expect to see generative AI largely improve. And as it improves, more use cases are discovered. More users can be attracted to the platform. So yeah, I'd say the trend is still very much ongoing today.
Okay. And do you want to build the bunker or no?
I'm an optimistic. I'm not a doomer.
Well, thank you, Jeremie. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And where can we find you?
You can find me. I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me on LinkedIn, or you can. I recommend you check out our website, SemiAnalysis.com. We have really great articles, again available for free, where we discuss in-depth technology trends. Trends on AI and semiconductors. So I definitely recommend checking that out.
Okay, thank you very much.